She moved quietly through the field hospital, a nurse with silvering hair and calm hands, patching wounds while young soldiers chuckled behind her back. They called her grandma, teased her soft voice, and questioned her place among warriors. She never flinched, never fired back, just worked with quiet grace. Until the day an injured pilot spotted her from his stretcher, eyes wide with recognition. "Ma'am, you flew with us over Helmand." The room fell silent. The mocking stopped. The soldiers stared, stunned, realizing they'd been laughing at a decorated combat pilot in scrubs. The sun cast a pale, clinical glow across the white-walled corridors of Forward Operating Base Regulus, a makeshift medical station nestled deep in a mountainous combat zone. Scents swept endlessly across the tarmac, and the air hummed with distant engines, radio chatter, and the subtle undertone of tension that never quite lifted in a war zone. Inside the base hospital, wounded soldiers lay on rows of stretchers, surrounded by antiseptic, murmured prayers, and the muted rhythm of combat medicine. Moving through the beds with practiced ease was Nurse Evelyn Rhodes, at 54. She was easily the oldest among the medical staff, with streaks of silver in her braided auburn hair and crow's feet etched by years of sun, wind, and smoke. Evelyn was often mistaken for a civilian volunteer or a medic long past retirement. She didn't correct the mistake. She rarely corrected anyone. She simply worked steadily, carefully, always calm in the storm. Too many of the young enlisted men. Evelyn was just the old nurse. They called her ma'am half-jokingly and whispered harmless jabs as she passed. How long she been here? Since Vietnam. But she's never even seen a rifle. Someone's grandma's moonlighting in the war. She heard them. She always did. But she never responded. Her focus stayed on the patients, checking vitals, cleaning wounds, preparing morphine, whispering words of reassurance. In the darkest hours of pain, if her hands shook from fatigue, no one noticed. If her shoulders stiffened at the jokes, no one saw. She carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned long ago that dignity needed no defense. Among the new rivals at the base were 3 soldiers from Echo Company, Private Sean Mills, Corporal Jared Simmons, and Specialist David Huck Huxley. Barely in their 20s, they had swagger to spare and opinions for days. They were good soldiers in the field, but their tongues ran loose behind the wire. They joked about Evelyn constantly, dismissing her calm demeanor as softness, interpreting her silence as weakness. She probably learned nursing in the 80s, Simmons muttered over chow. What's she even doing out here? Shouldn't she be stateside filing paperwork? Bet she faints at the sight of blood, Huck chuckled, or trips over her own for line. Sean smirked, but stayed quiet. Of the 3, he watched Evelyn the most curious, but not yet convinced she was more than she seemed. The base doctor, Captain Nadia Perez, a hard-nosed trauma surgeon with combat experience, didn't entertain their jokes. She had a deep, visible respect for Evelyn, often deferring to her without hesitation whenever a case was too unstable. It was Evelyn who stabilized it. When young medics froze under pressure, it was Evelyn who guided their hands. "You boys would do well to learn from her," Dr. Perez said once, shooting Simmons a sharp glance. "She's the reason a lot of you leave this tent upright." But the jokes continued, soft, thoughtless, and persistent. To them, she was just a nurse, older, quieter, less impressive than the kinetic energy of battlefield adrenaline. They hadn't yet learned what war truly demanded, not speed or swagger, but steadiness. What none of them knew, what Evelyn never shared, was that she had once worn a very different uniform. 2 decades earlier, she'd served as a combat pilot in the United States Air Force. Not just any pilot, but one of the few women in her cohort to fly close air support missions over enemy territory. During the surge in Afghanistan, her name was on more than one classified report. She had earned her Distinguished Flying Cross after piloting a critically damaged A-10 through a barrage of fire to rescue a pinned infantry unit. She had retired quietly, declining offers to write books, speak on panels, or lead recruiting campaigns. When the silence of civilian life left too much space for the memories to echo, she went back to school and became a nurse. She wanted to serve again, but this time in a way that healed rather than destroyed. So she signed up with a combat medical contractor, and returned to the same dust-covered zones she'd once flown over, this time with bandages and sutures instead of payloads. But she told no one at the base, not because she was ashamed, on the contrary. Her pride was deep and silent, but because she believed humility was the truest legacy of service. Let the young ones believe what they wanted. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to make sure they lived. Still, under the weight of constant dismissals, the silence grew heavier. There was a moral tension quietly brewing in the tent, the dissonance between appearance and reality, between earned wisdom and dismissed worth. Evelyn could feel it tightening in the background, not for herself, but for what it said about how easily society forgets what true service looks like. She'd seen soldiers die for medals they never received, for actions no one would remember. She'd seen medics lose sleep over a single life they couldn't save. And now, in this new era, she saw young men laughing at the hands that might one day keep them breathing. It wasn't just disrespect, it was disconnection. And she feared that unless it changed, unless they saw the truth, not only in her, but in the quiet dignity of all who serve without flash, then the next generation would carry more bravado than wisdom. And bravado, she knew too well, didn't stop bleeding. The tension didn't erupt, it accumulated. Slowly, a steady trickle of disregard, like water finding cracks in stone. Evelyn endured it as she always had, quietly. But silence, however disciplined, is not peace. It is simply the absence of noise. And inside the field hospital of forward operating base Regulus, disrespect made plenty of noise even when delivered. In whispers, the soldiers in Echo Company didn't hate Evelyn. That would have required seeing her as a threat. What they did was worse. They dismissed her, every half-smile concealing a smirk, every mock salute when she walked by, every time they called her grandma with a wink as if it were affection. It all added up. Corporal Jared Simmons was the loudest. His humor carried authority, even when it lacked substance. Bet Nurse Evelyn here did her training back when morphine came in wooden boxes. He chuckled once during a slow triage shift. The others laughed, not out of malice, but comfort. The kind of laughter that grows in groups when no one wants to be the one to push back. Specialist David Huck Huxley chimed in with ease. She probably thinks a tourniquet's a fashion accessory. More laughter. Private Mills gave a half-hearted smile, but looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Evelyn, focused on disinfecting a nasty leg wound, said nothing. Her hands moved with the same care they always had, precise, deliberate, unshaken. But beneath the surface, something shifted. Not anger, not wounded pride. Just a quiet disappointment. Not in them, but in the culture that allowed it. That night, as Evelyn wrote in her weathered journal, she paused and stared at her reflection. In the mirror above her cot, there were lines on her face that hadn't been there when she flew sorties over Kandahar. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not from age, but from the weight of being erased. It wasn't the jokes themselves, it was the misunderstanding beneath them, a cultural forgetting. These young men believed strength were a loud voice and a visible weapon. They didn't yet understand that the strongest people rarely need to announce it. Her dilemma was subtle but powerful. Should she correct them? Should she name her past, display her record, force respect through revelation? Or should she continue on, letting her actions remain her only defense? Either choice came with a price: speak, and risk shifting the atmosphere from camaraderie to discomfort, stay silent, and leave them to believe that service was something you could measure at a glance. The injustice wasn't in being mocked, it was in the lesson these boys were missing. They weren't just disrespecting her. They were building a worldview that dismissed anyone who didn't conform to their narrow idea of worth, and that was dangerous, not just for her, but for every quiet worker who came after her. The breaking point arrived under the gray cast of a midweek sky. A medevac was inbound. 3 soldiers wounded in a surprise mortar attack outside the wire. The incoming call crackled through the radio. 2 stable, 1 critical, ETA 5 minutes. The base mobilized. Evelyn snapped into motion, her hands already preparing fluids, gauze, and clamps. She didn't wait for orders. She never had to. She moved with instinct, with the rhythm of someone who had lived through worse than anything they'd see today. As the Black Hawk touched down in a swirl of dust and noise, Evelyn was already there, waiting. The doors opened. One of the wounded men was conscious barely, the others were sedated, tubes and bloodlines running like vines across their bodies. The conscious one groaned, eyes fluttering. His face was pale, soaked in sweat. A gash ran across his temple. Evelyn leaned in. "You're safe," she said. "We've got you." The soldier squinted, then stared. "Ma'am," he croaked. "Is that Rogue Angel?" Evelyn froze. The nickname. She hadn't heard it aloud in over 20 years. The young man's lips trembled into a smile. "Even through the pain, you pulled us out at Rabat Hill. You flew the Warthog." A silence fell over the landing zone, immediate and sharp. The soldiers around her, all those who had mocked, turned, the pieces beginning to fit. "You saved my brother," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "He told me about you. Said you were a ghost with wings." The medics lifted the stretcher and began wheeling him toward the tent. Evelyn walked beside it, expression unreadable. But her silence now held power, not retreat. Back in the trauma bay, as Evelyn worked beside Captain Paris to stabilize the wounded, no one spoke. Not Simmons, not Huck, not Mills. They simply watched. Later that night, Jason approached her cot. The others followed, reluctant, unsure. "Was that true?" Jason asked. "What he said about you flying?" Evelyn nodded. She didn't look up from her journal. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Huck asked. "Because I didn't need to," she said softly. "And you weren't asking." They stood in the silence, ashamed. Words came slowly. Simmons finally spoke. "We didn't know. And we treated you like I had nothing to teach you," she finished, her tone calm. "But you weren't the first, and you won't be the last. What matters now is what you do with what you've learned." The next morning, the change was subtle but unmistakable. The teasing was gone. When Evelyn entered the mess tent, soldiers stood to let her pass. When she stepped into triage, supplies were already prepped, and at the evening briefing, Captain Paris said it aloud. "For those of you who didn't know, Nurse Evelyn Rhodes flew 24 combat missions over hostile territory. She's one of the reasons this base exists. Remember that the next time you think quiet means unqualified." No one laughed anymore. But more importantly, they didn't pity her either. They respected her. Quietly, finally, the sun had barely risen when the wounded soldier's words echoed through the triage tent. For the third time that morning, Rogue Angel. And this time, it was no slip of morphine-induced memory. It was truth rising from the deep. Buried years of service and sacrifice that Evelyn had spent decades trying to carry quietly. He had spoken her call sign aloud, and the damage o'er. The correction had been done. By midday, the whispers had spread through the base like fire licking dry grass. In the mess tent, among the mechanics, even among the higher ranks, everyone now knew that the older nurse with the calm voice and the soft hands had once worn a flight suit and steered a 50-pound A-10 through valleys no sane pilot entered. That she had flown sorties through gunfire to protect ground troops. That she had bled in the cockpit but finished the mission anyway. And that she had walked away from all of it to become a nurse. Not a celebrity, a healer, not a name on a wall. But it wasn't until the official briefing that evening that the full weight of the truth landed. Captain Paris stood in front of her assembled staff. The blue tarp of the command tent taut above her, the dusk light casting soft shadows across. Her face. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Some of you have heard a name today," she began. "A call sign, Rogue Angel." The room hushed. "I want to confirm that yes, Nurse Evelyn Rhodes is Rogue Angel, former lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, decorated pilot, 24 confirmed combat sorties, 6 lives personally saved in hostile extractions, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross and Silver Star." A breath caught somewhere in the tent. Even Evelyn, who stood at the edge, felt a sudden stillness settle inside her chest. "I didn't know all of it either," Captain Paris continued. "She never told me, never asked to be treated differently. She just showed up, day after day, and taught me how to carry this work with grace." She looked directly at Evelyn now, "and she taught me that quiet is not the opposite of strength. It is its clearest expression." No applause followed. No cheers. Just a long, reverent silence. One that vibrated with acknowledgement, not pity. Later that night, The tone across the camp had shifted. Huck and Simmons approached her tent, not with sheepish faces, but with something deeper sincerity. Jason was with them, quiet and alert, visibly uncomfortable with what he now saw in hindsight. "Mum," Simmons began, "Evelyn, what I said before, about you not being in the field." She didn't let him finish. "You weren't wrong," she said gently. "You were just seeing with limited eyes." Simmons exhaled, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't know how much I didn't know." Evelyn nodded. "That's how all of us begin." Jason held something in his hand, an old flight patch, sun-faded but preserved in a clear pouch. "We found it in the old archives," he said. "Rogue Angel, your original squadron, sent it. They still remember. They still talk about you." Her eyes welled slightly. She took the patch carefully, fingers running across the embroidery. "Her squadron, ghosts now, mostly, but never forgotten. What you did back then," Jason started, then paused, "and then to come here and just serve. Silently, that's the part I can't stop thinking about." Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because being remembered is a gift, but remembering why you serve, that's the work." Huck looked up, his usual smirk gone. "You didn't want us to know. Because you didn't want us to treat you differently. Because I wanted you to treat everyone with dignity," she corrected gently. "Not just the ones with ribbons and stories." And then, the twist none of them expected, "I didn't stop flying because of my age," Evelyn added. "I stopped flying because my hand wouldn't stop shaking after I dropped ordnance on a village. We later learned held civilians. I carried that for years. Still do." The silence turned heavy. "I became a nurse not because I was done fighting," she said, voice steady, "but because I wasn't. I just changed how I fought." The words dropped like stone into water, rippling through each of them. She had been a warrior in the sky, but she had chosen to become a healer. And that choice, intentional, humble, deliberate, was the real act of courage. "You could have left," Jason said after a moment. "You could have stayed home. But then who would show the next generation what service really looks like?" Evelyn asked. Later, in the infirmary tent, Simmons sat beside a young recruit, recovering from an arm injury. He was no longer joking. He was listening carefully, just as Evelyn had done. Huck stayed late to help sterilize instruments, and Jason, for the first time since arriving, asked Evelyn to teach him sutures, not because he had to, but because he wanted to learn the right way. The transformation wasn't instant, but it was real. Respect had been earned, but more importantly, perspective had shifted. They no longer saw Evelyn as the old nurse. They saw her as a teacher, a witness, a guide, someone who had walked further than them, not just in years, but in understanding. And perhaps, more significantly, they saw each other differently too, because of her. Wrap up with justice, redemption, or emotional peace. Align with culturally preferred themes, e.g., accountability, quiet strength, respect. The next morning, the base awoke quietly, not with alarms or adrenaline, but with the subtle rhythm of change. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't declared, but it was felt. In the mess hall, soldiers who once passed Evelyn without acknowledgement now paused, nodding respectfully, offering quiet good mornings. Not performative, not exaggerated, just real. In the sterile light of the med tent, where the air usually buzzed with chatter, there was a new attentiveness, a gentleness. Huck now double-checked every tray before handing it to her. Simmons no longer joked. He listened. Private Mills, who had always harbored a quiet reverence for Evelyn, now moved closer when she spoke, leaning in, not to flatter, but to absorb. She saw it all and said nothing, but the difference in their eyes told her what she needed to know. They finally saw her clearly, not just for what she had done, but for what she continued to be. That afternoon, Captain Perez called an informal meeting. The mood was easy, almost celebratory. She didn't mention Evelyn directly, but she spoke about legacy, about quiet strength, about how real leadership often walks beside you in scrubs, not above you in rank. "Everyone here matters," she said. "Some people shout their impact, others whisper it. Learn to hear both." The young medics nodded. No one asked who she meant. They all knew. Outside the tent, the evening sun cast long shadows across the camp. Evelyn sat by her little herb garden, sipping weak coffee, the dessert wind ruffling the edges of her worn uniform. The same uniform she'd always worn, but now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because they had. Jason approached, slowly, a folded cloth in his hand. She looked up, curious but unbothered. "I had this stitched," he said, offering it to her. "It's not regulation, but I thought you might appreciate it." She unfolded the cloth. It was a new name patch, hand-embroidered by one of the supply sergeants. "Our HODES Rogue Angel," she smiled, tracing the thread with her thumb. "Thank you, but you know I'll never wear it." "I figured," Jason said, "but it was never about wearing it, just about knowing it belongs to you." Evelyn nodded, folding it gently and tucking it into her pocket. A small gesture, a quiet redemption. Simmons joined them a moment later, unusually reserved. "Ma'am, Evelyn, I was thinking of writing home, telling my mom about you." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, she always said real heroes don't need to brag," he said, voice soft. "You proved her right." The moment held, suspended in the golden light. Huck, arriving with water bottles, tossed one to her. "Don't think we're going easy on you now." He grinned. "You're still the one who makes us look slow on rounds." She chuckled, cracking the cap open. "I wouldn't want it any other way." In the following days, things settled. The base continued its work. Evacuations came and went. New wounds were treated, old ones reopened. But in the ebb and flow of war, something had changed within its quietest corner. Evelyn noticed it first, in the posture of the younger medic, straighter, more intentional. Then in the way patients were spoken to with dignity, not efficiency. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a new understanding that strength was not speed, and respect did not come with rank, but with presence, with consistency, with service. One evening, she found a note taped to the inside of the medical tent's cabinet. No name, just 5 words. "I see you now. Thank you." She didn't need to know who wrote it. That wasn't the point. Later that month, a visiting colonel came through with an entourage, tall, sharp-voiced, and impatient. When Evelyn entered the room, he turned to Captain Perez. "Is she one of the volunteers?" Captain Perez responded flatly, "No, sir. She's the spine of this entire tent." The colonel blinked. Evelyn gave a small, courteous nod and kept walking. She had become, without trying, a standard, a quiet benchmark against which others now measured their patience, their effort, their presence. She had never asked for it, but she'd earned it. At the end of her rotation, when her deployment was complete, the soldiers gathered not in ceremony, but around the fire pit near the tarmac. A goodbye of warmth, not formality. Jason handed her a small leather-bound notebook. Inside were handwritten notes from nearly everyone on base, stories, gratitude, lessons they'd learned just by watching her. Simmons stood and raised a tin mug. "To Evelyn Rhodes, who taught us that service doesn't end when the shooting stops, and that the quietest people often have the most to teach." They drank, not as soldiers to a superior, but as people to a teacher, a peer, a guardian. Evelyn smiled, heart full but calm, and when she boarded the helicopter home, nobody clapped, nobody saluted. They just stood, hands at their sides, hats held to chests, not out of protocol, but out of respect. Real, earned, and lasting. Some heroes never raise their voice. They don't demand medals, and they don't correct those who misunderstand them. They lead by example, serve with humility, and let their actions speak louder than their past. Evelyn's story is not just about one woman, it's about the quiet strength that lives all around us. Often overlooked, often unspoken. How many people have we dismissed because they didn't look like the role they carried? How often do we forget that dignity doesn't wear rank, it wears patience, presence, and purpose? If Evelyn's journey moved you, if it reminded you of someone who serves quietly in your life, someone whose worth is measured not in words, but in the weight they carry without complaint, then honor them now. Comment the word below, a single word to say, "I see you now, and I won't forget what dignity truly looks like."